I've been asked several times about how I knit, and I just want to make a short video about how I personally knit. Some details though. The thing about knitting is right when it looks right. If your knitting looks like knitting, it's knitting. If it looks like stockinette, it's stockinette. If it looks like garter stitch, it's garter stitch. Now, I did this garter stitch by knitting every row. But I could have done the same effect, had an identical looking piece of fabric, if I had purled every row. So whether you knit every row or purl every row, you will get the same effect. Which one is correct? Both are correct. What is correct is getting the right result. There is no right process. Okay, that being said, let's talk about some of the basics of knitting. We have some stitches on the needle, and I want to, not even trying to knit, I just want to stick the needle in, and as I do so, you can see I have a nice big open stitch. I've stuck the needle from the front to the back, and I've caught the first stitch, the first half of the stitch that's closest to the point. And what I mean by that is a knitting stitch off the needle wants to be this way. When you put it on the needle, you can put one half of the leg towards the front and one half towards the back so that you twisted it slightly. But you can, this is called a Western mount. In a Western mount, the leg that is closest to the needle point, see the leg that's closest to the needle point, it's easier to see with it open, is the leg that is in the front of the needle. You could also put the stitch on the needle like this. When the stitch is on the needle like this, in order to have that same open look to the stitch, move this back a little, just have that same open look to the stitch, you put your needle in, and the back leg is closest to the needle point and the front leg is closest to the back end of the needle. So there's point and back end. So this stitch is called an Eastern mount. If you're not familiar with Eastern mount, you might think this stitch is wrong. It's not wrong, it's Eastern mount. And for people who knit Eastern, it's perfectly correct. And then there's me, and about 20% of the other knitters in the United States. And worldwide, it varies. In some places, Eastern knitting is the only way to do it. In other places, it's unknown. But so what I do is I do what's called combination knitting. So I'm going to return this stitch to its Western conventional mount, and we're going to knit 20 stitches. And when we knit 20 stitches, or when we knit stitches, period, let's talk about what we do. We put the needle into the front of the stitch to open it up. Okay, so we put the needle in the stitch in such a way that the stitch is open. We wrap the yarn around the needle clockwise, pull the stitch out, jump it off. In so the stitch is open, wrap clockwise, off. In so the stitch is open, wrap clockwise, off. Clockwise, the yarn comes from 6 o'clock at the bottom of the needle to 9 o'clock, to 12 o'clock, to 3 o'clock, back down to 6 o'clock. It's going round clockwise. Open stitch, open stitch, open stitch, clockwise wrap, open stitch, clockwise wrap, open stitch, clockwise wrap. Now, there are people who consider this Western style of knitting to be the only acceptable style. There are people like me who say, hey, whatever floats your boat works. If you do it with your thumb, if you do it with your pinky, if you do it with your right hand, if you do it with your left hand, whatever works for you, whatever floats your boat, is, in my opinion, the correct way to knit for you. Are there disadvantages to not knitting Western? Yes, because patterns are written in Western. So I've done another row of garter stitch, and now what I'd like to do is switch from garter to stockinette, which means I need to do a row of purls. And for purls, the yarn comes to the front, the needle's put in the stitch so the stitch is open, and the yarn is wrapped counterclockwise. It goes from 3 o'clock to 12 o'clock to 9 o'clock back to 6 o'clock, and the stitch is slid off. The stitch is opened, the yarn is wrapped counterclockwise, and this basically is the complete reversal of a knit stitch. So we have a complete reversal. Now I'm going to do 10 stitches this way, and I'm going to show you then another way of wrapping. And so I'm going to open the stitch, wrap counterclockwise, open the stitch, wrap counterclockwise, and let's see where we are now. We've done 2, 4, 6, 8. I know I have 20 stitches, so 9, 10 is half the stitches. Now that is not the way I wrap my yarn when I'm purling. When I wrap my yarn, I do what is called an Eastern wrap. So what I do is come into the stitch and I do a clockwise, starting at the bottom at 6, going to 9 to 12 to 3. That's a clockwise wrap. Come in, don't do the counterclockwise, do a clockwise. The advantage to the clockwise is it makes a slightly tighter loop, so it's slightly easier to pull the stitch off, and it's slightly easier for me to maintain tension, and the result is I can go a little faster. So I like this because I think it's physically easier and physically faster. Here's the downside. When we come to this side of the work and we want to knit, what we're going to find as a result of wrapping clockwise instead of counterclockwise is our stitches are mounted backwards. So let's do this. Let's put the needle in as if we were going to do a standard knit stitch, and look, see how it's tight at the bottom? Well, maybe you can't see that that bottom is crossed, but if I put it in the back stitch, you can see how the stitch can open up. It opens up this loop here so that we have a really open stitch. And that is the difference between an Eastern mount and a Western mount. These stitches have Eastern mount, which means the stitch is mounted so that the back leg of the stitch is closest to the needle point. So when I knit, I have to knit into the back leg of the stitch. Let's try this. I wrap clockwise just as I would normally. I go into the back leg of the stitch again, see how open it is versus going in there. I think that twist is pretty clear. If I go into the front leg, which is conventional Western knitting, I ended up with a twisted stitch with its legs twisted at the bottom. If I go into the back, I get an open stitch. I want an open stitch because otherwise I'm going to be creating cross stitches. Cross stitches are perfectly valid, but cross stitches are not part of stockinette. Stockinette is not made from cross stitches. There is a version called cross stitch stockinette, but that's cross stitch. So what happens is my stitches are mounted differently. Now I have been knitting a long time, and what I have discovered is I can just seamlessly go from knitting in the back to seeing that I have to knit in the front. I see the difference in the stitch. I feel the difference in the stitch if I'm not looking. And this is a more conventional stitch. So now I'm back to those first 10 stitches that I did with a conventional Western style purl, which wraps counterclockwise, and now I'm going to wrap again the rest of the row clockwise. What has changed is how I'm entering the stitch. I'm now entering into the front leg, not the back leg, to get my uncrossed stitches. And this combination of an Eastern style mount and a Western style mount results in a combination of mounts and is called combination knitting. So there is Eastern knitting, there's Western knitting, and there's combination knitting. Now, just a quick glance, you can see that none of my stitches are twisted. Vaguely, you can see, maybe not, I can see, where I switch from one to the other. There is a slight change in gauge. It's very minuscule. It's the sort of thing that does wash out as soon as you block it. So, this is one of the differences, and you will find if you watch my knitting videos, you will see that I do combination knitting, and how I do combination knitting, and how it affects things. And I'm going to do another row. I'm going to do a complete row of combination purls, which is to say Eastern purls, which is to say purls that I come in, I wrap clockwise, and the result is the mount is going to be wrong. And as I say, I find this physically easier to do. I'm doing this through the viewfinder. Can't even see my hands. And it does, it does work for me. And Modaset has written extensively about this. There are some advantages to this besides speed, even tension. There's less rowing out, less wonky bits in your ribbing. There's a lot of different advantages to doing this Eastern mount on the purl side, but there's some disadvantages. So let me show you the first disadvantage. The first disadvantage is when you go to do a decrease. Now normally when you want to do a knit two together, and I'm going to do a knit two together and 2 stitches in, I'm going to do 1 and 2, and now I'm going to knit 2 together. Well, what I'm doing is I'm knitting 2 together through the back loop, and my decrease is leaning to the left, not to the right. In conventional knitting, when you knit 2 together, you get right leaning decreases. I get left leaning decreases, or the same as an SSK. If I want to do a right leaning decrease, and I'm going to do a yarn over, and let's do 1, 2, 3, 4. If I want to do a right leaning decrease, I have to do almost a reverse SSK. I have to take 2 stitches, turn them, put them back on the needle, then knit into the front of the stitch in order to get a right leaning decrease. So if I'm reading knitting directions and it calls for an SSK, I have to do a knit 2 together. And if it calls for a knit 2 together, I have to do this slip, slip, return, knit. So it's SSTK. So conventional directions need to be modified if you do this sort of modified sort of knitting, that you modify your purls and do Eastern purls. You're going to have to modify. The mnemonic I use is that inside of a 2 there is a left leaning slant. From the hook top of the 2 you slant down to from the right to the left, and then you have the base of the 2. If I see a knit 2 together, I look at the 2 and I say I need to do a decrease that's going to result in a left leaning decrease. And this is how I remember it. Likewise, in an SSK, the S's have a shape that leans this way in the middle, and if I want to do a decrease that leans to the left, it will say SSK, and I know that that's a left-leaning decrease. So that's my way of remembering it. By looking at the S or the 2, I know which way the decrease needs to lean in the pattern, and then I modify my knitting to accomplish that. Some people think that's a lot of mental work, and they're perhaps right. Since I learned to knit this way, and I learned to compensate at the age of 10, and I'm now over 50, or correction, I've been knitting more than 50 years, but of course, you know, I'm just 51 because we're not admitting to all this. But what happens is I've learned to think this style of knitting a very, very long time ago. So for me, remembering whether to do a left-leaning or a right-leaning decrease is second nature. It's not going to be second nature to you. So that is one of the real disadvantages to doing combination knitting, is learning to modify your decreases. That's the primary difference, I would say. Another difference comes along when you want to do some decreases. Normally you do a knit one, pass one over. However, you can also knit 2 together. Knit 2 together usually causes a different decrease, but not for me. I can actually knit 2 together, and because my stitches are mounted in a different direction, when I do a knit 2 together as opposed to a purl 2 together, I can get a very loose bind off with absolutely no effort. I don't have to change how I position the needle. I just get a standard decrease.